My name is Thaddeus Whitlaw. I used to fly into hurricanes for a living. Now I fight to survive in a world turned to ice. When the volcanic winter hit, I saw it coming. They ignored my warnings. Within days, civilization collapsed as temperatures plummeted. I escaped with classified data that powerful people want. This is my story of survival in the new ice age. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. I never thought I'd be recording this. My name is Thaddeus Whitlaw. For 15 years, I flew into the heart of hurricanes as a NOAA hurricane hunter pilot and atmospheric scientist. I've navigated through Category 5 storms, collected data in conditions that would terrify most pilots, and always managed to make it back home. But no storm I ever flew into prepared me for what happened when the world froze over. 3 months before everything collapsed, I started noticing unusual patterns in our atmospheric data. The jet stream was behaving erratically, splitting and reforming in ways I'd never seen in 20 years of meteorological research. High-altitude wind patterns showed anomalous cooling trends that didn't match any of our existing models. At first, I thought our equipment might be malfunctioning, but cross-referencing with international weather stations confirmed it. Something was changing in our atmosphere. I compiled my findings into a report for my superiors at NOAA. The data suggested we might be heading toward a rapid cooling event. Not just a harsh winter, but something potentially catastrophic. The response I got wasn't what I expected. They thanked me for my diligence, filed the report, and 2 days later, I found myself reassigned from active flight duty to desk work, reviewing standard weather models. My director called it a temporary reassignment to utilize my analytical skills, but the message was clear: stop rocking the boat. That should have been my first warning that something bigger was happening. In all my years at NOAA, we'd always followed the data, no matter how unlikely or alarming the conclusions. But this time was different. I later discovered internal memos suggesting my findings had been flagged by oversight committees outside our normal scientific channels. I continued my analysis privately, using personal equipment and contacts with colleagues in meteorological stations around the world. The patterns weren't just persisting, they were intensifying. The upper atmosphere was cooling at an accelerating rate that defied our standard climate models. When I tried again to sound the alarm, I was told to focus on assigned duties or risk administrative leave. It was around this time I noticed something strange at my home in coastal Louisiana. I've always been an amateur birdwatcher. It pairs well with weather observation, and one morning in early October, I witnessed something I'd never seen before. Mixed flocks of birds, species that normally don't migrate together, were heading south in massive numbers. Not just local birds, but species from much further north were passing through. Nature was sending a warning that something was wrong. I contacted Dr. Elaine Chen, an ornithologist I'd worked with on hurricane impact studies. She confirmed similar observations across multiple monitoring stations. Bird migrations were happening weeks early, and in patterns that broke all previous records. When she published her preliminary findings, her funding was suddenly reallocated to other projects. By mid-October, I'd created an unofficial network of weather watchers, colleagues who shared my concerns and were willing to exchange data outside official channels. We called ourselves the Canaries, after the birds in coal mines that warned of danger. We saw the signs building: unusual frost patterns in northern regions, accelerated glacial movement in Greenland, and subtle shifts in ocean currents. Then came October 17th. I was reviewing satellite imagery when reports came in about a massive volcanic eruption in Indonesia. Initial assessments classified it as significant, but not world-altering, similar to Pinatubo in 1991. But my analysis of the ash plume's composition and dispersion pattern told a different story. This eruption was ejecting precisely the type of particulate matter that could reflect sunlight back into space, and it was happening during a solar minimum, a period of reduced solar output that occurs every 11 years. I made the call to my network that night: prepare for rapid temperature drop. I advised them to stock supplies, ensure heating systems were operational, and prepare for potential power outages. Some thought I was overreacting. They remembered other volcanic eruptions that caused temporary cooling, but nothing civilization-ending. This felt different. Within 48 hours, temperatures across the northern hemisphere dropped an average of 15 degrees, below seasonal norms. Weather services attributed it to an unusual cold front. When it dropped another 10 degrees the following day, they called it a historic weather anomaly. No one was using the words volcanic winter or ice age yet, but I knew what we were facing. By October 22nd, 5 days after the eruption, temperatures had plummeted 40 degrees below seasonal averages across North America, Europe, and Northern Asia. Power grids were failing as demand for heating overwhelmed capacity. Gas stations ran dry as people tried to flee south. Grocery stores were emptied in hours. The president addressed the nation, assuring everyone that the government was mobilizing resources and that the cooling was expected to be temporary. I knew better. My model showed that the volcanic ash had triggered a cascade of climate feedback loops. As snow and ice covered more land, more sunlight was being reflected back into space rather than warming the Earth. The cooling was feeding on itself, accelerating beyond even my most pessimistic projections. That morning I made my decision. I packed my emergency weather gear, radio equipment, satellite phone, and, most importantly, my research files and custom atmospheric modeling software. I filled my truck with as much fuel as I could store, safely unloaded supplies for at least a month. As an emergency responder with NOAA, I had access to certain resources and stockpiles. I used every access code and credential I had. When the evacuation order came through for coastal Louisiana, I didn't join the millions heading for the southern border. My models showed that even Texas and Florida would be experiencing freezing temperatures within weeks. Instead, I headed for the NOAA Auxiliary Facility in the Ozark Mountains, a hardened research station built during the Cold War and upgraded for climate research in the early 2000s. It was positioned at a unique elevation that made it ideal for atmospheric sampling, and I knew it contained equipment I could use to continue my research. More importantly, I knew the access codes, and because it was largely automated, it was unlikely to be occupied. The last view I had of my hometown was through a light snowfall, something that had never been recorded in that region in October. People were standing in their yards, looking up at the sky with expressions of wonder and fear. Children were catching snowflakes on their tongues, not understanding that each beautiful crystal was part of a coming catastrophe. As I drove north, the radio brought increasingly alarming news. Chicago was experiencing record snowfall that had paralyzed the city. Power outages were spreading across the Northeast as ice brought down transmission lines. The governor of Minnesota had declared a state of emergency as temperatures hit negative 20 degrees Fahrenheit in October. I tried calling my contacts at NOAA headquarters but couldn't get through. Cell networks were overloaded, and many towers were already down due to power failures or ice damage. I switched to my emergency radio and began logging the transmissions I picked up. Most were from emergency services struggling to cope with the surge in cold weather injuries, traffic accidents, and power outages. What struck me most was how unprepared everyone was. Americans are used to winter storms, but not like this, not so suddenly and not so early in the season. People didn't have their winter supplies ready. Cities hadn't prepared their salt trucks and plows. It was like a hurricane hitting without warning, except this one was hitting everywhere at once and wouldn't be passing through. The roads became more treacherous as I moved north. Interstate highways were clogged with abandoned vehicles. I passed a jackknifed semi-truck that had slid off an overpass. Its trailer split open, and the contents, cases of bottled water, frozen solid in bizarre sculptures across the roadside. By nightfall, the temperature reading on my truck's dashboard showed negative 15 degrees. Ice was forming on the inside of my windows despite the heater running full blast. I knew I couldn't risk stopping for the night. In these temperatures, if the truck's engine died, I could freeze to death in hours. I kept driving, stopping only to refuel from my reserve tanks when necessary. The few gas stations I passed had either run dry or had no power to pump fuel. Most were abandoned, their windows already frosted over with intricate ice patterns. At one station near the Missouri-Arkansas border, I found the attendant still there, huddled next to a propane heater behind the counter. He looked at me like I was insane for heading north. "Everything's frozen that way," he said. "You won't make it 50 miles. I asked if he had a plan. "Staying put," he replied. "Got food, got heat. Figure someone will come eventually." I didn't have the heart to tell him what my models predicted, that the temperature would drop another 20 degrees within days, that his propane would run out long before help arrived, that eventually might be months or years away. Instead, I gave him one of my spare emergency blankets and a box of high-calorie ration bars. As I continued north, the roads became increasingly impassable. What had been a light snowfall in Louisiana had become feet of snow in Arkansas. My truck, thankfully, was a specialized NOAA vehicle with reinforced chassis and all-terrain capabilities, designed to reach remote weather stations in adverse conditions. Still, there were stretches where I had to reduce my speed to less than 10 miles per hour, crawling through snowdrifts that reached the hood. The sky had a strange quality to it, a dull, brassy color during daylight hours, as if the sun were trying to shine through a thick, tarnished filter. At night there were no stars visible, just an oppressive darkness that seemed to amplify the cold. My thermometer recorded negative 25 degrees that night, temperatures that the Gulf Coast region might never have experienced in human history. I passed through small towns that were already transforming into frozen ghost towns. In one, I saw a group of people breaking into a hardware store. They weren't taking electronics or cash, they were loading insulation materials, propane heaters, and generators into pickup trucks. They saw me but made no move to stop or approach my vehicle. There was a moment of mutual recognition. We were all doing what we needed to survive. The further north I traveled, the more evident it became that we were experiencing something unprecedented. News reports on my satellite radio were becoming more alarming by the hour. Chicago had recorded temperatures of negative 40 degrees, colder than Antarctica at the same time. The power grid for the entire eastern seaboard was operating at critical levels. The president had activated the National Guard in all 50 states. I encountered my first major obstacle about 100 miles into Arkansas. A massive pileup had completely blocked the interstate, at least 30 vehicles, including several jackknifed tractor trailers. There was no way around it without going off-road, which was risky given the snow depth. But what truly struck me wasn't the accident itself. It was the absence of emergency vehicles. No police, no ambulances, no fire trucks, just abandoned vehicles, some with doors left open as people had fled on foot. I had to forge my own path through a shallow ditch beside the highway. My truck strained against the deep snow, but the specialized tires and reinforced undercarriage handled it. As I passed the wreckage, I glimpsed shapes beneath the snow that I tried not to focus on. People who hadn't survived the initial crash, or who had succumbed to the cold while waiting for help that never came. That was when I truly understood what we were facing. This wasn't a crisis that would be managed with emergency services and government response. The system was already overwhelmed. Those who survived would do so by their own resourcefulness or sheer luck. About 20 miles further, I came across a family stranded on the side of the road. A man, woman, and 2 children huddled in a sedan that had run out of gas. They had blankets wrapped around them inside the car, but in these temperatures, that wouldn't keep them alive through the night. I couldn't leave them there. The father approached my truck cautiously as I pulled alongside them. His face was already showing early signs of frostbite across his cheeks and nose. I offered them a ride, and their relief was palpable. They had been there for 6 hours, he told me. 3 vehicles had passed without stopping. The family squeezed into my truck, Lisa and Martin with their 2 daughters, Emma and Kira, ages 9 and 6. They had been trying to reach relatives in Tennessee when their GPS led them onto this route that hadn't been plowed. By the time they realized their mistake, they were low on fuel and the snow was too deep to turn around. Lisa was a nurse at a hospital in Little Rock. When the crisis hit, her hospital had been overwhelmed with hypothermia cases and cold-related injuries. She'd worked 36 hours straight before the hospital director ordered all staff with families to evacuate south. Martin had loaded their most important possessions and winter clothes into the car, But they hadn't anticipated how quickly fuel would run out in the extreme cold. I had to make a difficult choice. My truck could handle the extra weight, but 4 more people meant 4 times the oxygen consumption, 4 times the food requirements, and significantly reduced range. The NOAA facility was still hundreds of miles away, but there was no question of leaving them. Over the next 50 miles, we passed dozens more stranded vehicles. Each time the family looked at me questioningly. Each time I had to assess, could we fit more people? Did we have enough supplies? Would the weight slow us? Down too much, I stopped. For an elderly couple who had nothing but summer clothes and a thin blanket between them. The others I had to drive past, and each one felt like a stone in my chest. When we stopped to refuel from my reserves, Martin helped me clear ice from the fuel lines. He asked me where we were headed, and I told him about the NOAA facility. "Do you think it will be safe there?" he asked. "Safer than most places," I replied. "It's designed to be self-sufficient for atmospheric research and remote conditions. Solar power with battery backup, geothermal heating, rainwater collection system, and 6 months of emergency rations for a staff of 12. "And you're sure we'll be allowed in?" Lisa asked, overhearing our conversation. I didn't tell her that technically I was committing a federal offense by bringing civilians to a government research facility. I just nodded and said, "I have the access codes." What I didn't mention was my greater concern, that others might have had the same idea. The facility wasn't classified, just remote. Any NOAA employee with the right clearance would know about it. If others had already arrived, would they welcome us or see us as a threat to limited resources? We made better time than I expected through northern Arkansas. The highways were largely abandoned now, and in some stretches, the snow was packed, down enough by previous traffic to provide decent traction. But as we approached the Missouri border, I noticed the fuel gauge dropping faster than it should have been. The extreme cold was reducing the truck's efficiency, and the extra weight wasn't helping. At a small town just south of the border, we found a miracle, a gas station with a generator still running. The owner was a Vietnam veteran who had converted the generator to run on propane years earlier for just such an emergency, though I doubt even he had imagined anything like this. He was charging exorbitant prices for fuel, 10 times the normal rate, but he also offered hot coffee and information, both invaluable. While I refueled, he showed me a trucker's atlas with routes marked in red. "These are impassable," he said, pointing to several major highways. National Guard tried to keep them clear the first few days but gave up. Too much snow, too fast. These ones in blue are your best bet. Secondary roads that run along natural ridgelines. Snow doesn't pile up as deep there because of the wind patterns. As I paid him with emergency cash I'd brought, he looked at the children in my truck. "You folks heading south?" he asked. "North," I replied. "To a research facility in the Ozarks." He gave me a long look. "Most people are trying to get to Texas or Florida. Word is the government's setting up massive refugee camps there." "And how's that working out?" "Radio said they're already overcrowded, disease spreading, not enough supplies." He lowered his voice. "Between you and me, I think those camps are death traps. Too many people, not enough resources. Smart play might be staying put or finding somewhere isolated." As we prepared to leave, a pickup truck pulled into the station. The driver was a man I recognized immediately, Dr. James Kellerman, a meteorologist I'd worked with on hurricane tracking systems years ago. He'd been stationed at the Chicago field office last I heard. When he saw me, his eyes widened in recognition. Thaddeus Whitlaw." We embraced briefly, the awkward hug of colleagues who'd never been physically demonstrative before, but were overwhelmed by finding someone familiar in this new frozen world. "What are you doing out here?" he asked. "Heading to the Ozark facility," I told him. "What about you?" "Trying to get south, but it's not looking good. Roads are completely blocked past Springfield, military checkpoints everywhere. They're prioritizing certain personnel for evacuation." While the others were inside warming up, James pulled me aside and pressed a small object into my hand. A thumb drive. "Your model's about the cooling event," he whispered. They were right. But there's more. This contains internal communications from NOAA leadership and other agencies dating back 6 months. They knew something was coming, Thad. Maybe not this exact scenario, but something major. They classified your findings not because they thought you were wrong, but because you were right. Before I could ask more questions, he glanced nervously at a black SUV that had pulled up across the street. I need to go. Be careful who you share that information with. Some people would kill to control that kind of intelligence now. James drove off quickly and we departed shortly after, following his advice to avoid the main highways. The veterans' alternative routes proved valuable, allowing us to make good progress despite deteriorating conditions. But James's parting words in the thumb drive weighed heavily on my mind. If the government had anticipated this crisis and deliberately suppressed warnings, how many lives could have been saved with proper preparation? The temperature continued to drop as we moved north into Missouri. My truck's thermometer read -35 degrees, and the wind chill factor made it effectively much colder. Even with the heater running, constantly frost was forming on the inside of the windows. The children had developed persistent coughs, and Lisa was concerned about their core temperatures. We wrapped them in every blanket we had and took turns holding them to share body heat. We were making decent progress along a county road when disaster struck. A patch of black ice, invisible beneath a light dusting of snow, sent us into a spin. I fought the wheel, trying to regain control, but momentum carried us toward the edge of a steep embankment. In the final seconds before impact, I had one clear thought: all my research, all the evidence on that thumb drive would be lost if I didn't survive. The truck slid sideways off the road and rolled once before coming to rest against a cluster of trees. The impact deployed the airbags and shattered the passenger side windows. Cold air rushed in immediately. By some miracle, no one was seriously injured. Cuts, bruises, and Martin had a likely dislocated shoulder, but we were alive. The truck, however, was finished. The front axle was broken and fuel was leaking from a ruptured line. We had minutes to gather whatever supplies we could carry before the cold made it impossible to function effectively. I grabbed my backpack, with essential weather equipment, the satellite phone, radio, and crucially my research files and the thumb drive from James. Lisa organized medical supplies while Martin, despite his injury, helped the girls salvage food and water. We took turns carrying the younger child as we began walking toward what my GPS indicated was a small town about 7 miles away. Those 7 miles were the longest of my life. The wind cut through our layers of clothing like they were tissue paper. Every breath felt like inhaling shards of glass. The snow was knee-deep in places and we had to take turns breaking trail. Emma began crying from the cold about 2 miles in, and nothing we said could comfort her. Kira, the younger one, had become worryingly quiet, her eyes half closed. Lisa recognized the signs of hypothermia immediately. We stopped and constructed a makeshift shelter using a tarp from my emergency kit, huddling together to share body heat. I used chemical heat packs from my survival gear, placing them at the children's core and extremities. We couldn't stay long. The temperature was still dropping and night would be upon us soon, but we needed to raise their body temperatures before continuing. While we rested, I checked my satellite phone. The network was congested, but I managed to download a weather update. What I saw confirmed my worst fears. The cooling wasn't stabilizing, it was accelerating. Weather stations across the northern hemisphere were reporting record lows, with no signs of the pattern reversing. This wasn't just a short-term crisis. It was the beginning of something much worse. When we resumed our journey, I carried Kira, while Martin carried Emma despite his injured shoulder. Lisa took most of our supplies. We walked in silence, saving our energy, each lost in thoughts of what lay ahead and what we'd left behind. The small town, when we finally reached it as dusk was falling, was largely abandoned. Most buildings were dark, with snow drifted against doors and windows. But one structure showed signs of life. The local volunteer fire station had smoke rising from its chimney. We approached cautiously. In normal times, a fire station would be a place of safety and help. But these weren't normal times, and desperation could turn anyone into a threat. I went ahead alone first, wanting to assess the situation before exposing the family to potential danger. The firefighters, 4 men and 2 women who had stayed behind when most of the town evacuated, welcomed us with wary hospitality. They had converted the station into a shelter, using the firehouse's emergency generator sparingly and burning wood in a large barrel stove for heat. 12 other refugees had already found their way there. That night, as the family slept on, cots in what had been the firefighters' break room, I examined the thumb drive James had given me. The files confirmed what he had said. 6 months earlier, climate scientists from multiple agencies had presented classified reports warning of potential rapid cooling scenarios. My own research had been incorporated into these reports, even as I was being officially silenced. Most disturbing were the contingency plans. The government had begun preparation for what they termed population concentration scenarios. Massive, southward relocations that would inevitably lead to refugee crises. They had calculated acceptable loss percentages and resource allocation formulas that effectively determined who would receive aid and who would be left to fend for themselves. I couldn't sleep after reading those files. I stood by a window, watching snow continue to fall in the dim glow of the generator-powered security light outside. This town, like thousands of others across the country, had been deemed unsustainable in the new climate paradigm. Its residents were statistically considered part of the acceptable losses. We stayed at the fire station for 2 days, allowing everyone to rest and recover. Martin's shoulder was indeed dislocated, and one of the firefighters with military medical training helped reset it. Lisa treated frostbite cases among the other refugees, using supplies from the station's first aid kits. On the morning of the 3rd day, I made the difficult decision to continue alone. The family had been accepted into the fire station community, and they would be safer there than continuing north with me. The journey ahead would be even more treacherous, and I could move faster on my own. More importantly, I needed to reach the facility to analyze the data I'd collected and potentially establish a communication network that could save more lives. Lisa understood immediately, though the children protested tearfully. I left them with most of my remaining supplies and my emergency beacon. If conditions worsened, or if help became available, they could activate it. Get that information to someone who can use it, Lisa told me as we said goodbye. Make it matter that we know. I trekked north alone through terrain that grew increasingly treacherous. With each mile, the temperature dropped further. My beard froze solid, each exhaled breath creating crystals in my facial hair that accumulated until I had to break them off. I lost feeling in my toes first, then my fingers. I stopped every hour to remove my boots and massage my feet, knowing that if frostbite set in, my journey would end permanently. The landscape had transformed into something alien. Trees had split open from the extreme cold, creating rifle crack sounds that echoed through the silent forests. Lakes and rivers weren't merely frozen, they were solid, with ice thick enough to support my weight without a single creak. I walked across waterways that in summer would have required boats to navigate. On my 2nd day alone, I encountered 2 frostbite victims huddled in an abandoned gas station. Both were young men who had tried to walk to the next town when their car ran out of fuel. Neither had proper cold weather gear. Their fingers and faces showed the telltale blackening of severe frostbite. I shared what medical supplies I could spare, knowing it wasn't enough. They asked me to take a message to a family address in Springfield if I made it through. I wrote it down, though we all knew the chances of postal service resuming anytime soon were virtually non-existent. I reached the edge of the Ozark Plateau on what I calculated was day 10 since the temperature drop began. The elevation gain made progress even slower, but also provided an unexpected advantage. From the heights, I could see for miles across the transformed landscape. Plumes of smoke rose from scattered locations, other survivors trying to stave off the cold. More concerning were the dark military helicopters I observed flying in formation to the east. They weren't engaging in rescue operations. They were moving with purpose toward some predetermined destination. I finally reached the NOAA facility on the morning of day 12. From the outside, it appeared abandoned, a nondescript complex of low buildings surrounded by meteorological equipment solar arrays, and satellite dishes. Snow had drifted against the security fence, nearly reaching the top in places, allowing me to climb over, rather than using the access gate. My hope for an empty facility vanished when I approached the main entrance. Fresh footprints in the snow led to and from the door, and through a window, I could see lights operating inside. Someone had beaten me here. I considered my options. I could try another entrance, perhaps approach covertly to assess who had occupied the facility. But in this cold, stealth would be difficult, and if they were hostile, I might not get a second chance. I decided on a direct approach. Either they would welcome another survivor or they wouldn't, and I was too close to my goal to turn back now. I entered my access code on the keypad by the main door. The light flashed green, and the lock clicked open. As I pushed the door, inward I was hit by a wave of glorious warmth that made my frozen skin sting painfully as it began to thaw. I called out, identifying myself as NOAA personnel. There was a moment of tense silence, then a voice responded from the interior corridor. "Hands where we can see them. Move slowly." I complied, raising my hands and stepping into the light. 3 people stood in defensive positions, one holding what appeared to be a makeshift weapon, a fire extinguisher mounted on a pole. Upon seeing my NOAA identification and recognizing my weather-specialized gear, they lowered their improvised weapons. "Dr. Whitlaw?" A woman stepped forward, narrowing her eyes. "From the Hurricane Division?" I recognized her as Dr. Samira Khalid, a climate modeler I'd collaborated with on several papers years earlier. She'd been assigned to this facility for high-altitude research before I was reassigned to desk duty. "Samira," I acknowledged, relief flooding through me. "I didn't expect to find anyone I knew here." "There are 7 of us," she explained, leading me deeper into the facility. All NOAA or affiliated researchers who realized what was happening and made the same calculation you did about this place. The facility's main operations room had been converted into a communal living space. Sleeping bags and personal belongings were arranged around the perimeter, while the central monitoring stations remained operational. 4 more people were there, all looking up with the same wary expression I'd faced at the entrance. Samira introduced them. Dr. Marcus Chen, a glaciologist, Dr. Elena Volkov, an atmospheric chemist, Taylor Washington, a telecommunications specialist, and 2 graduate students, Zoe Williams and Ricardo Fuentes, who had been working at the facility when the crisis began. The 7th person, she explained, was currently resting, Dr. William Hayes, a meteorologist from the Kansas City office who had arrived with severe frostbite that they were treating. "We've been monitoring atmospheric conditions since the eruption," Samira explained as she helped me remove my frozen outer layers. "The data is unlike anything in recorded history. The particulate density in the upper atmosphere has created a reflective layer that's blocking nearly 40% of solar radiation." "How long have you been operational here?" I asked. "Ricardo and Zoe were already here when it started. The rest of us arrived within the first week. We've been pooling our resources and knowledge, but honestly, we're flying blind. The global monitoring network is collapsing as stations lose power or are abandoned." I told them about my journey, about the classified reports James had given me, and about the conditions I'd observed across 3 states. They listened intently, especially when I mentioned the military helicopters. "We've seen them too," Taylor confirmed, and picked up encrypted transmissions on frequencies usually reserved for emergency management. "Something big is happening, but they're keeping it compartmentalized." We spent that first day sharing information and assessing our situation. The facility was in relatively good shape. The solar arrays were still functioning despite the reduced sunlight, supplemented by backup battery systems. The geothermal heating was maintaining a livable temperature throughout the complex. Food supplies were adequate for 7 people for about 6 months if carefully rationed, now 8 people with my arrival, which would reduce that time frame. The most valuable asset was the equipment. The facility contained advanced atmospheric monitoring tools, satellite uplinks, weather radar, and a sophisticated computer system for modeling climate patterns. If we could maintain power, we had the capability to monitor what was happening to Earth's climate in real time. That evening, After I had rested and eaten my first hot meal in days, we gathered to establish a plan. Ricardo, despite being the youngest, had emerged as something of a leader due to his intimate knowledge of the facility's systems. "We need to define our objectives," he said. "Are we just trying to survive, or do we have a greater purpose here?" Elena, the atmospheric chemist, was adamant. "We're scientists, maybe the only team of climate scientists still operating with this level of equipment. We have a responsibility to document what's happening and try to understand it." Understanding. "Won't matter if no one survives to benefit from that knowledge," Marcus countered. "Our priority should be establishing contact with other survivor groups, sharing resources, creating a network." I shared my perspective. "It's not an either-or proposition. We can do both. But first, I think we need to analyze the data we have, particularly what's on this thumb drive. If the government knew this was coming and chose not to warn the population, we need to understand why, and whether they had projections about how long this cooling will last." We agreed to divide our efforts. Elena, Samira, and I would focus on analyzing the atmospheric data and climate models. Marcus and William would work on cataloging our resources and establishing sustainable usage protocols. Taylor, Ricardo, and Zoe would focus on communications, both monitoring existing channels and attempting to establish contact with other survivor groups. Before we separated, I asked the question that had been on my mind since arriving. "Has anyone tried to contact family members? Do we know what's happening in the major population centers?" A heavy silence fell over the room. Finally, Taylor spoke. "Most communication networks are down. Cell towers require regular maintenance and power, which they're not getting. Landlines are more resilient, but still dependent on functioning exchanges. I've picked up scattered radio transmissions, mostly from amateur operators and some military frequencies." "What have you heard?" I pressed. He hesitated. "It's not good. Major cities are experiencing catastrophic infrastructure failures. Power. Plants can't operate in these temperatures without specialized equipment. Water mains are freezing and bursting. Food distribution has collapsed in most areas. The government appears to be focusing resources on a few southern sanctuary zones, but is overwhelmed by the scale of the migration." "And the international situation?" "Similar patterns globally. Countries closer to the equator are somewhat better off, but still experiencing unprecedented cold. Europe is in the same situation as us. Russia had better cold weather infrastructure to start with, but even they weren't prepared for this rapid drop. And developing nations with limited resources are just facing a humanitarian catastrophe." The reality of our situation sank in. We weren't just 8 scientists in a remote facility. We might be among the few groups in the Northern Hemisphere with the resources, knowledge, and equipment to understand what was happening to our planet. That night, I couldn't sleep despite my exhaustion. I found myself in the monitoring room reviewing the atmospheric data from the facility's sensors. Samira joined me around midnight, bringing a cup of hot tea. "You should rest," she said. "We have time to analyze this tomorrow." "Do we?" I asked. "Every model I've run suggests the cooling is accelerating. The reflective effect of the snow and ice is creating a feedback loop, just as I feared." She looked over my shoulder at the displays. "These temperature gradients are impossible. We're seeing shifts that should take centuries occurring in days." "Not impossible," I corrected. "Just unprecedented in human history. The Earth has experienced rapid climate shifts before. They're documented in ice cores and geological records. We just haven't lived through one." "Until now," she added soberly. We worked through the night, combining my hurricane modeling expertise with her climate system knowledge to create new simulations based on the current data. As dawn approached, though with the thick cloud cover, dawn was just a slight lightening of the darkness, we had our first comprehensive model of what was happening. The volcanic eruption had ejected precisely the wrong type of particulate matter at precisely the wrong time in Earth's orbital and solar cycle. The resulting atmospheric changes had triggered cascading effects, shifting jet streams, altered ocean currents, and most critically, the rapid expansion of polar ice sheets. Each expansion of ice increased Earth's albedo, its reflectivity, further reducing the solar energy absorbed by the planet. How long? Samira asked, looking at the projections. How long until it stabilizes? I ran the numbers again, hoping I'd made an error. I hadn't. Based on current trends, this cooling will continue for at least 6 to 8 months before reaching equilibrium. After that, recovery depends on how quickly the particulate matter settles out of the atmosphere. And how long will that take? 2 to 5 years minimum, possibly much longer. She sat heavily in her chair. So we're looking at a minimum of 3 to 6 years of ice age conditions, possibly decades if the feedback loops become self-sustaining. That's the most likely scenario, I confirmed, and that's assuming no additional volcanic activity or other climate-forcing events. In the morning, we presented our findings to the group. The reaction was somber. We weren't dealing with a temporary crisis that would resolve in weeks or months. We were witnessing the beginning of a new climate regime that would last years, possibly generations. We need to recalibrate our thinking, Elena said after digesting the information. This isn't about riding out a storm. It's about adapting to a new world. Over the following days, we settled into a routine. We maintained the facility's systems, monitored atmospheric conditions, and established communication protocols. Taylor managed to repair and optimize the satellite uplink, giving us access to whatever imaging satellites were still functioning. We began mapping the extent of the ice and snow coverage, documenting the progression of this new ice age. Ricardo and Zoe focused on making our resource usage sustainable. They adjusted the solar arrays to maximize efficiency in the reduced sunlight and set up systems to collect and filter snowmelt for water. We inventoried our food supplies meticulously, calculating precisely how many calories each person would receive daily to extend our supplies as long as possible. William recovered enough from his frostbite to join our efforts, though he lost 2 toes to the condition. His experience with severe weather events proved valuable as we developed protocols for venturing outside the facility when necessary. On day 18, we made our first significant contact with the outside world. Taylor picked up a clear transmission from a ham radio operator in Oklahoma, who had established a network of fellow enthusiasts across several states. Through this network, we began to piece together a picture of what was happening across the country. The situation was grim. Major cities had been largely abandoned or were functioning at minimal levels. Power was intermittent at best, non-existent in most places. The military had established control zones in parts of Texas, Florida, and Southern California, where they were attempting to manage massive refugee populations. Disease was spreading in these overcrowded areas, and resources were stretched beyond breaking point. But we also heard stories of resilience. Communities in rural areas were pooling resources and knowledge. People with skills in agriculture, construction, mechanics, and medicine became leaders. Old technologies were being rediscovered: wood, stoves, hand pumps, mechanical tools that didn't require electricity. We debated our responsibility. Should we try to reach one of these communities? Should we share our knowledge of what was happening to the climate? Would it help people to know that this wasn't a temporary crisis but a new reality they needed to adapt to? Knowledge is power, Marcus argued. If people understand what they're facing, they can make better decisions. Or it could lead to despair, William countered. Sometimes hope, even false hope, keeps people going. I found myself thinking of Lisa and her family at the fire station. Would it help them to know that the cold wouldn't end with winter? That spring wouldn't bring warmth and renewal? Or would that knowledge crush the spirit that had kept them going? In the end, we decided to be selective with our information. Through the ham radio network, we began sharing practical advice: which materials provided the best insulation, how to prevent frozen pipes, methods for growing food in cold conditions, medical treatments for frostbite and hypothermia. We shared our forecast models so communities could prepare for storms, but we were cautious about revealing the full extent of our longer-term projections. On day 20, our situation changed dramatically. Taylor detected unusual radio traffic on military bands, encrypted transmissions that he couldn't decode, but that were increasing in frequency and seemed to be triangulating on locations in our region. They're looking for something, he said. Or someone. That same day, Marcus spotted a drone while checking the exterior sensors. It circled the facility twice before departing to the south. They know we're here, Samira said. Question is, who are they and what do they want? We got our answer the next morning when Taylor intercepted a clear transmission on an emergency band. Attention, NOAA Ozark Research Station. This is Colonel James Hargrove, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. We have detected your power signature and communications. We will be arriving by helicopter at 0900 hours tomorrow to assess your facility and personnel as part of Operation Greenhouse. Maintain your position and prepare for evacuation. We gathered to discuss this development. Operation Greenhouse, the same project mentioned in the classified files from James's thumb drive. According to those documents, it was a contingency, planned for maintaining food production during an extended cooling event, using underground facilities, artificial lighting, and geothermal heating. They want our expertise, Elena concluded. Climatologists, atmospheric scientists, we're valuable resources now. Or they want to silence us, I countered, thinking of how my earlier warnings had been suppressed. We have evidence that they knew this was coming and did nothing to prepare the general population. Does it matter? Ricardo asked. They have helicopters, weapons, and authority. We have a remote research station with limited supplies. It matters, I insisted, because knowledge is the most valuable resource in this new world. Controlling information about when or if conditions will improve gives tremendous power. If the military is centralizing that knowledge, we need to ask why and for whose benefit. We spent the next 24 hours in intense debate about how to respond to the military's imminent arrival. The group was divided. Some saw cooperation as our best chance for survival and impact. Others feared we would lose control of our research and be used to support policies that might not benefit the broader population. I examined the files from James's thumb drive again, focusing on the details of Operation Greenhouse. What I found was both promising and disturbing. The military had converted several decommissioned missile silos and bunkers into underground growing facilities, using LED lighting arrays and hydroponic systems to produce food independent of outdoor conditions. They had the infrastructure to potentially feed thousands, maybe even tens of thousands of people. But the distribution plans were strictly hierarchical. Government officials, military personnel, and essential specialists would receive priority. The general population would receive rations only after these priority groups were taken care of, and only if supplies allowed. The coldly clinical language referred to population sustainability thresholds and acceptable attrition rates for different demographic groups. I shared these findings with the others, which only intensified our debate. This is standard emergency management, William argued. In a crisis, you ensure the survival of those who can rebuild and maintain essential systems. It sounds heartless, but it's logical. Logical if you're among the chosen, Elena shot back. I don't recall signing up to be part of an elite that survives while others freeze. Samira, who had been quiet during much of the debate, finally spoke. What if we take a third option? Neither blindly cooperate nor futilely resist. Her plan was bold. We would appear to cooperate, but would first ensure that our most important research and data were secure and distributed beyond their control. We would establish dead drops of information with the ham radio network we'd contacted. We would create encrypted backups of our climate models and projections, hidden throughout the facility in case we needed to return covertly. They need us, more than we need them, she pointed out. Our expertise is valuable only if we're willing to apply it. That gives us leverage. We worked through the night, preparing for the military's arrival. Taylor transmitted encrypted packets of data to trusted contacts in the ham radio network. Elena and I finalized our climate models and created simplified versions that could be distributed to survivor communities without specialized equipment. Marcus and William cached emergency supplies at strategic locations around the facility, in case we needed to leave quickly. Ricardo and Zoe created a detailed inventory of the facility's equipment and its capabilities, information we could use as bargaining chips. Most valuable was the satellite uplink that Taylor had optimized. which provided communication capabilities few other locations would have. At dawn on day 24, we heard the distant thrum of helicopter rotors. They landed in the clearing, east of the main building, 2 Black Hawk helicopters with no markings except small American flags. I watched through the monitoring room window as soldiers secured the perimeter, moving with the practiced efficiency of special operations teams. A tall figure emerged from the lead helicopter, Colonel Hargrove, I presumed. He wore white Arctic camouflage and carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to immediate compliance. With him was a civilian in a heavy parka who looked strangely familiar. When they reached the main entrance, Taylor buzzed them in. We had decided to meet them in the conference room, presenting ourselves as the organized scientific team we were, rather than desperate survivors. The colonel entered first, removing his snow-covered hood. He was older than I expected, probably, in his 50s, with close-cropped gray hair and the weathered face of someone who had spent much of his life outdoors. The civilian behind him was a shock, Dr. Lawrence Phillips, the deputy director of NOAA, my former superior who had reassigned me from flight duty when I presented my cooling predictions. Dr. Whitlaw, Phillips said, clearly as surprised to see me as I was to see him. I didn't expect to find you here. Likewise, I replied coldly. Last I heard, you were busy filing my research under alarmist speculation. The colonel intervened smoothly. I see some introductions are in order. But perhaps we could start with an assessment of your situation here. Your facility appears to be in remarkably good condition considering the circumstances. Samira stepped forward as our designated spokesperson. We've maintained full operations, Colonel. Our power systems are stable. Our monitoring equipment is functional. And we've been collecting atmospheric data continuously since the event began. Impressive, he nodded. And how many personnel do you have here? 8 scientists with various specializations, she replied, not volunteering our names or specific expertise yet. The colonel's expression remained neutral, but I detected a flicker of satisfaction. 8 climate scientists with a functioning research facility was obviously more than he had expected to find. I'm sure you have questions, he said, addressing the room. Dr. Phillips can explain the nature of Operation Greenhouse and why we're here. Phillips cleared his throat uncomfortably, aware of the tension in the room. Operation Greenhouse is a contingency program developed jointly by FEMA, the Department of Defense, and several scientific agencies, including NOAA. Its purpose is to ensure food production capabilities in the event of a catastrophic climate shift, like the one some of us predicted and were silenced for reporting, I interjected. Phillips had the decency to look embarrassed. Yes, well, that's a complicated matter that we can discuss. The important thing now is that we have established several underground growing facilities using geothermal heating and LED lighting systems. But optimizing those systems requires atmospheric and climate expertise that we're currently lacking. So you need us, Elena said bluntly. The country needs you, the colonel corrected. This isn't about any individual or organization now. This is about survival. Whose survival exactly? I asked, pulling out printouts of the distribution priorities I'd found in the classified files. According to these documents, you've already decided whose lives matter more. The colonel's expression hardened. Those are classified materials. May I ask how you obtained them? Does it matter? They confirm that Operation Greenhouse isn't about saving as many people as possible. It's about saving the right people. That's a mischaracterization, Phillips interjected. The priorities reflect practical necessities. We have to maintain governance and security structures or everything collapses. And what about the communities already adapting on their own? Samira challenged. The ones establishing local governance, sharing resources, finding ways to survive without government help because none was forthcoming? Admirable, but ultimately unsustainable, the colonel replied. Without centralized planning and resource allocation, those communities will fail as supplies run out. We're offering a structured approach that maximizes survival chances for the largest sustainable population. The conversation continued in this vein for hours. The colonel was surprisingly forthright about the challenges they were facing. The southern refugee zones were overwhelmed. Disease was spreading rapidly in the overcrowded conditions. Food riots had broken out in several locations. The military was stretched thin, trying to maintain order while also converting facilities for long-term habitation. "We need your expertise," he concluded. "Your knowledge of atmospheric conditions, climate modeling, and meteorological prediction is essential for planning agricultural cycles, managing resource distribution, and preparing for weather events. In return, we offer security, resources, and the chance to make a meaningful difference in this crisis." We asked for time to discuss their proposal privately. Once they left the room, we huddled together, speaking in low voices despite the privacy. "They seem genuine about needing our help," Marcus observed. "Of course they are," I replied, "but that doesn't mean their priorities align with what's best for the most people. They're focused on maintaining existing power structures." "What's the alternative?" William asked. "Stay here until our supplies run out? We can't help anyone if we're dead." "We could take their transportation and resources but maintain our independence," Ricardo suggested. "Negotiate terms that allow us to share information with outside communities." After much debate, we decided on a conditional acceptance. We would agree to help with Operation Greenhouse, but with specific terms. We would maintain communication with the outside world. Our research would remain unclassified, and we would have input into resource distribution decisions. When we presented these terms to the colonel, his expression remained impassive. "I understand your concerns, but operational security is non-negotiable. Communication with unverified outside parties presents risks we cannot accept." "Then we cannot accept your offer," Samira stated firmly. For a moment, tension filled the room. Then Philip spoke up. "Perhaps a compromise. What if your communications were monitored but not restricted unless they presented a clear security risk, and we could establish official channels for distributing vetted information to survivor communities?" The colonel didn't look pleased, but he nodded reluctantly. "I can work with that with certain safeguards in place." We seemed to be reaching a tentative agreement when the facility's perimeter alarm sounded. Taylor rushed to the monitoring station and reported back. "Armed group approaching from the north. At least 15 individuals heavily equipped." The colonel immediately took charge, ordering his soldiers to defensive positions. "This is why operational security matters," he said grimly. "Word gets out about a functioning facility with supplies, and this is what happens." Through the security cameras, we watched as the approaching group reached the perimeter fence. They didn't look like desperate refugees. They moved with military precision, using hand signals and maintaining formation. Their equipment was mismatched but professional grade, a mixture of hunting gear and tactical equipment. "Not regular military," the colonel observed, "but trained. Former military or law enforcement, most likely." He grabbed his radio and contacted the soldiers outside. "Hold positions. Do not engage unless fired upon. I want to see what they want." The leader of the approaching group stopped at the gate and held up his hands to show he wasn't immediately threatening. He called out, requesting to speak with whoever was in charge. The colonel turned to us. "This facility has a security protocol for unexpected visitors. Where's the external communication system?" Ricardo led him to a control panel near the entrance. "External speakers and microphone here. Camera feed on this monitor." The colonel identified himself and asked the group's purpose. Their leader responded clearly. "We represent the Midwestern Alliance, a coalition of survivor communities from 5 states. We're not here to threaten you. We're here because we detected your communications with our ham radio network. We want to propose cooperation, not conflict." The colonel looked skeptical but continued the dialogue. "What kind of cooperation? We have agricultural specialists, engineers, medical personnel. We've established secure locations and begun rebuilding. What we lack is accurate climate information to plan our efforts. We know you have scientists and equipment here. We're offering an alliance, our practical skills and established communities in exchange for your technical knowledge and forecasting abilities." The colonel turned to us with a raised eyebrow. "Convenient timing. Or maybe not so convenient," suggested. "If they've been monitoring our communications, they would have known the military was coming. They probably rushed here to make contact before you could isolate us. The standoff continued for tense minutes as the colonel assessed the situation. Finally, he made a decision. I'm sending out a team to speak with them. Dr. Phillips, you'll represent our scientific contingent. 2 of you should come as well, he added, gesturing to our group. I volunteered immediately, as did Samira. As we prepared to go outside, I pulled her aside. This might be our best chance, I whispered. If this Midwestern Alliance is legitimate, they represent exactly the kind of grassroots adaptation we wanted to support. Or they could be another power group looking to exploit our knowledge for their own benefit, she cautioned. Either way, we need options beyond the military's plan. The meeting took place in the neutral ground between the facility and the perimeter fence. The Midwestern Alliance representatives were indeed former military and law enforcement, but they had organized around protecting civilian communities rather than imposing control. Their leader, a former Army Ranger named Davis, explained their structure, a loose federation of communities that maintained independence while sharing resources and expertise. We're not trying to rebuild the old world, Davis explained. We're adapting to the new one. Our communities are developing cold-weather agriculture, converting existing structures for maximum insulation, establishing trade routes that can function in these conditions. What impressed me most was their information network. They had created a system of weather stations using salvaged equipment, maintained by ham radio operators who transmitted observations on a regular schedule. It was crude compared to our sophisticated monitoring systems, but it showed initiative and understanding of what mattered in this new world. The colonel listened impassively, asking occasional pointed questions about their weapons, organization structure, and resource management. Philip seemed genuinely interested in their adaptive strategies. Samira and I exchanged glances, both recognizing that this group represented a third path, neither the military's top-down control nor isolated survival. As we walked back to the facility for further discussion, an urgent call came through on the colonel's radio. One of his soldiers reported that they had intercepted a transmission indicating another military unit was en route to our location, one not affiliated with Operation Greenhouse. What does that mean? I asked. The colonel's face darkened. It means Operation Greenhouse isn't the only contingency plan that was activated. There are competing interests within what remains of the government. Not everyone shares our priorities. You mean they want to control information about the climate situation even more tightly than you do? I translated. He didn't deny it. We need to move quickly. If they secure this facility and the expertise it contains, the consequences could be severe. It was in that moment that I realized the true value of what we possessed. It wasn't just the facility or even our scientific knowledge. It was the independence, to use that knowledge for the greater good rather than to consolidate power. If we left with the colonel, we would have resources and protection, but our information would be controlled. If we joined the Midwestern Alliance, we would have more freedom, but fewer resources. The colonel sensed my hesitation. This isn't the time for idealism, Dr. Whitlaw. The approaching unit answers to people who believe information control is essential for preventing panic and maintaining order. They won't negotiate as I have. So our choices are go with you, where our information will be controlled but not completely suppressed, or risk falling into the hands of those who would suppress it entirely, Samira summarized. There's a third option, Davis interjected. Come with us. We can move you and as much portable equipment as possible to our main community. It's not as sophisticated as this facility, but it's well defended and self-sufficient. The colonel shook his head. A risky gamble at best. My helicopters can have you at a secure location before the other unit arrives. Their community, he gestured toward Davis, would be a prolonged journey over dangerous terrain with no guarantee of success. We had minutes to decide. The approaching unit would arrive within hours. The colonel needed to evacuate soon to avoid confrontation. The Midwestern Alliance representatives were already preparing to withdraw to defensive positions. I looked at Samira, silently asking what she thought. Her expression was resolute. We need to put it to a vote, she said. All 8 of us. This isn't a decision you or I can make alone. We hurried back inside to join the others. The situation had grown even more complex while we were outside. Taylor had intercepted additional transmissions, suggesting that the approaching military unit had orders to secure the facility and detain all personnel found there, by force if necessary. "They're not coming to recruit us," he explained grimly. "They're coming to ensure we don't share what we know." The colonel confirmed this assessment. There are factions that believe tight information control is necessary. They see independent scientific analysis as a threat to stability. We called an immediate vote. The result was split: 4 in favor of going with the colonel, 3 for joining the Midwestern Alliance, and 1 William undecided. "I don't trust either option completely," he admitted, "but we need to decide now." William's uncertainty left us at an impasse until Elena made a sudden proposal that changed everything. "We split up," she said firmly. "Some go with the colonel, some with the Alliance. We distribute our knowledge and resources across different groups as insurance. No single faction controls all the information." Her suggestion hit me like a thunderbolt. She was right. Our greatest strength wasn't just our combined expertise, but also our ability to disseminate it widely. If we divided our group, we could maintain connections between different survival efforts while ensuring our knowledge couldn't be completely suppressed. The colonel immediately objected. "Dividing your team reduces your effectiveness. You need each other's specialized knowledge." "True," Samira countered, "but we've already documented our most important findings. Each subgroup would have access to the core climate models and projections. What we might lose in collaboration, we gain in resilience and reach." After intense debate, we reached a decision. Elena, Marcus, and William would go with Colonel Hargrove to the Operation Greenhouse facility. Samira, Taylor, and I would join the Midwestern Alliance. Ricardo and Zoe would remain at the facility to continue monitoring atmospheric conditions, with contingency plans to evacuate if the approaching military unit proved hostile. The colonel wasn't happy, but he recognized it was the best compromise available. "We leave in 30 minutes, he announced. "Pack only essential equipment and personal items." Those 30 minutes were a blur of activity. We copied our climate models and research onto multiple storage devices. Elena prepared stripped-down versions of our atmospheric models that could run on less sophisticated computers. Taylor configured emergency communication protocols that would allow our separated teams to maintain contact through encrypted channels. I found myself working alongside Dr. Phillips, the NOAA deputy director, whose dismissal of my earlier warnings still rankled. He seemed humbled by events, helping us pack equipment without his earlier bureaucratic arrogance. "I should have listened to you," he said quietly as we catalogued atmospheric sensors. "We all should have." "Would it have made a difference?" I asked. He considered this. "Perhaps not on a global scale, but we could have prepared better, saved more lives in the initial chaos. That's why we're doing this now," I told him. "It's not too late to make better choices." The helicopters departed at midday, taking Elena, Marcus, William, and Dr. Phillips to the Operation Greenhouse facility, in what we learned was a repurposed missile silo in western Kansas. The Alliance representatives led Samira, Taylor, and me through the forest to their hidden vehicles, a collection of modified snowmobiles and one large truck with massive snow tires. Before leaving, I embraced Ricardo and Zoe, who had volunteered for perhaps the most dangerous role, remaining behind to monitor conditions and potentially face the approaching military unit. "The emergency evacuation route is prepared," Ricardo assured me. "If they show hostile intent, we'll be gone before they breach the facility. The self-destruct protocols for the sensitive equipment are set." "Be careful," I told them. "Your lives are worth more than any data." Our journey with the Alliance was brutal. Even with their specialized vehicles, traveling through the frozen landscape was slow and treacherous. We followed logging roads and game trails, avoiding major highways where abandoned vehicles and military checkpoints would block our path. Davis, the Alliance leader, explained their organization as we traveled. They had formed in the early days of the crisis when local law enforcement Emergency services and civilian volunteers realized no federal help was coming. We started with 3 communities in Missouri, he explained. Former military and police provided security. Farmers and engineers handled food and shelter. Medical personnel coordinated health care. We established communication through ham radio operators and expanded from there. How many people are part of your alliance now? Samira asked. About 14,000 across 5 states in 27 communities, some as small as a few dozen people, others with over 1,000. Each community is largely self-governing but follows shared protocols for resource sharing and mutual defense. The scale surprised me. In my journey north, I had encountered only small groups of survivors. The idea that thousands had successfully organized suggested humanity's adaptability was greater than I had feared. We traveled for 3 days, stopping at smaller alliance outposts to rest and refuel. Each was different, one in a fortified farm complex, another in a small-town community center, a third in a renovated warehouse. All shared common features: efficient use of space, carefully managed resources, and a clear chain of command that balanced military discipline with civilian input. On the evening of the 3rd day, disaster struck. Taylor, who had been struggling with increasingly severe chest pain, collapsed during a rest stop. The Alliance medic diagnosed a heart attack, likely triggered by the extreme cold and stress of our journey. Despite their best efforts, Taylor died that night. His last coherent words were instructions for accessing his encrypted communication protocols. "Make sure the networks stay connected," he gasped. "Information flow is life now." We buried him at that outpost, marking his grave with his ham radio call sign. His death hit us hard. Not just the personal loss of a colleague and friend, but the realization of our own mortality and the fragility of the knowledge we carried. The next day, as we continued our journey, I spotted a bird. A raven, its black, feathers stark against the white landscape, flying with purpose rather than desperation. It was the first bird I'd seen in weeks that wasn't struggling or dying, and something about its adaptation gave me a flicker of hope. We finally reached the Alliance's main community on day 28 of the crisis. It was centered around what had once been a small liberal arts college in rural Missouri. The campus had several advantages: stone buildings with thick walls, a geothermal heating system installed years earlier as a green energy initiative, a library with extensive printed resources, and enough dormitories to house hundreds. More importantly, the community had adapted with remarkable ingenuity. They had converted the college's greenhouse into a food production facility, growing hardy vegetables under salvaged grow lights powered by a small hydroelectric dam on the campus creek. The gymnasium had been transformed into a workshop where people repaired equipment and fabricated needed tools. The library served as both information center and community hub. Sarah Coleman, the community coordinator, gave us a tour. She had been the college's facilities manager before the crisis and knew every system and building intimately. "We've housed about 800 people so far," she explained. "Everyone works according to their abilities. No one goes hungry as long as they contribute." When she learned of our meteorological expertise, her eyes lit up. "You have no idea how valuable that knowledge is to us. We've been trying to predict weather patterns based on pre-crisis models, but they're worthless now. Our agricultural planning, hunting parties, supply runs, everything depends on accurate forecasting." We were given space in the science building to set up our equipment. The Alliance had salvaged an impressive array of computers and communication gear, though nothing as sophisticated as what we'd had at the NOAA facility. Still, it was enough to run simplified versions of our climate models and establish contact with other Alliance communities. Samira and I worked through the night, setting up our systems and preparing our first comprehensive briefing for the Alliance leadership. The data wasn't encouraging. Our models showed the cooling would continue for at least another 4 months before stabilizing at a new, much colder average. Recovery would take years, not months. The question was how to present this information. Should we be completely transparent about the long-term projections, potentially undermining morale, or focus on practical short-term forecasting that could help immediate survival? After discussing it, we decided on complete transparency with the leadership, but a more measured approach with the general population. People needed hope, but false hope would lead to poor decisions and eventual disillusionment when reality failed to improve. The Alliance leadership received our briefing the next morning in what had been the President's conference room. 7 people, representing security, food production, healthcare, engineering, communications, resource management, and overall coordination, listened intently as we explained what had happened to Earth's climate and what they could expect in the coming months and years. "So this isn't a temporary crisis," Coleman stated after we finished. "This is our new reality." "For the foreseeable future, yes," I confirmed. "The cooling will eventually stabilize, but even after that, temperatures will remain far below pre-crisis levels for years, possibly decades." Instead of despair, I saw determination harden in their expressions. They immediately began discussing implications for their plans: how to convert more buildings for indoor agriculture, how to improve insulation, how to expand their hunting territories as animal populations shifted. "We suspected as much," Davis admitted. "The pattern was too consistent, too progressive to be temporary. But having confirmation lets us plan properly." That afternoon, we received our first communication from Elena's group at the Operation Greenhouse facility. Their transit had been smoother than ours, and they had integrated into the military's scientific team. The facility was impressive, a converted missile silo with 10 underground levels, powered by nuclear generators and equipped with state-of-the-art hydroponic systems. Elena reported that their climate findings matched ours, but the military was indeed controlling information flow tightly. They were allowed to share technical data with us, but were prohibited from communicating with other outside groups. The Operation Greenhouse leadership was focusing on supporting the southern refugee zones, rather than independent communities like the Alliance. More concerning was her report about Ricardo and Zoe. The military unit that had been approaching our former facility had indeed taken control of it. According to intelligence the colonel had received, our colleagues had escaped, but were now being actively hunted. Their last known transmission indicated they were heading west, seeking another Alliance community they had heard about through the ham radio network. This news cast a shadow over our integration into the Alliance community. I found myself checking the emergency channels hourly, hoping for word from Ricardo and Zoe. Samira threw herself into establishing a meteorological training program for Alliance members, teaching them how to read the new weather patterns using simplified versions of our models. On day 30 of the crisis, we received 2 pieces of significant news. First, a weak transmission from Ricardo indicated that he and Zoe had found shelter with a small community in the Ozarks, though they were still being pursued and would maintain radio silence for safety. Second, Elena reported that Operation Greenhouse had detected signs of additional volcanic activity in the Pacific Ring of Fire, potentially exacerbating the cooling effect. That evening, I stood on the roof of the science building, surveying the transformed landscape. The campus was nestled in a valley now filled with snow drifted 20 feet deep in places. The surrounding forest, once green and vibrant, was a sculpture garden of ice-covered trees that creaked and occasionally shattered in the intense cold. The temperature that night was negative 42 degrees, a number that once would have seemed impossible for this region. Yet amidst this frozen world, I saw signs of life and adaptation. Smoke rose from carefully managed fires in buildings throughout the campus. People moved between structures along cleared pathways, bundled in layers of clothing. Through windows, I glimpsed classrooms converted to living spaces, where families gathered around salvaged heaters. In what had been the football field, I could make out the dark shapes of deer carcasses hanging from a makeshift processing facility, the result of a successful hunting expedition. Humanity was adapting as it always had. Different than before, perhaps smaller in number and more focused on immediate survival than long-term ambitions, but adapting nonetheless. Samira joined me on the roof, wrapped in so many layers she was barely recognizable. "Coleman wants us to start broadcasting daily weather forecasts to all Alliance communities tomorrow," she said. "She thinks it will help coordination and morale." "She's right," I agreed. "Knowledge is survival now. The more communities understand what they're facing, the better their chances." "Do you think we made the right choice?" she asked, "splitting up instead of staying together?" I considered this question carefully. I think we created resilience. If any one group fails or is compromised, the knowledge survives elsewhere. It's how nature ensures species survival, diversity and adaptation, not consolidation. In the month since the world began freezing, I had witnessed both the worst and best of humanity. I had seen people abandon others to save themselves, and I had seen strangers risk their lives to help those in need. I had seen governments collapse and new communities rise from the chaos. I had seen nature's devastating power and its remarkable capacity for adaptation. I thought of the raven I had spotted during our journey, black wings against white sky, finding a way to survive in this transformed world. Perhaps that was humanity's path forward as well, not trying to reclaim what was lost, but adapting to what now existed, finding new ways to live in a world of ice and snow, creating communities based on cooperation rather than competition, because the margin for survival was too thin for anything else. The satellite data showed ice sheets expanding across continents, glaciers reforming in regions that hadn't seen them in millennia. The world I had known was gone, perhaps for generations. But standing there watching people move purposefully through their new reality, I felt something I hadn't expected: hope. Not hope for a return to what had been. That world was gone. But hope for what might yet be built among the ice and snow. A society more aware of its fragility, more conscious of its dependence on natural systems, more deliberate in its choices. If enough knowledge survived, if enough communities adapted and connected, humanity would endure this new ice age. Different, transformed, but alive. And when the ice eventually receded, whether in years or decades or centuries, they would carry forward not just the technical knowledge we had preserved, but the hard-won wisdom of what it meant to survive when everything changed. My name is Thaddeus Whitlaw. I used to fly into hurricanes to gather data that might save lives. Now I forecast the patterns of a frozen world to help a new society take root among the ice. This record of the first 30 days is not just a testament to what was lost, but a foundation for what might yet be built. If you're listening to this, you are part of that future. Learn from our mistakes, build from our knowledge, adapt, survive, connect. The world is cold now, but humanity's fire still burns.